Thank you very much. So this is a meeting of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment, and we're here this morning to hear from a couple of people that are involved with wildlife management in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Lawrence Rubin with the Inuvialuit Game Council has joined us this morning. And then at 10:30 we have Jody Pellicy with the Wek'èzhìì Renewable Resources Board. But I'd like to maybe start with introductions from my colleagues on the committee here this morning, and I'll go to my left and start with Mr. Johnson.
Alan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Caitlin Cleveland, MLA for Cam Lake.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Rocky Simpson, MLA here River North or South.
Thank you. Now we'll go to the couple that have joined us virtually this morning. Please go ahead, Ron and Jackie.
Ron Bondrus, MLA Decho.
And I think we're also joined by Mr. Jacobson. Is he frozen by any chance? Or, no? Okay, he's muted. So I'll introduce Jackie. It's Jackie Jacobson, the MLA for Nunavut, has joined us as well, and he's just figuring out how to unmute himself there. But thanks very much to everybody for joining us this morning. And sorry, we do have some staff that have joined us in the room. We have our research committee advisor, Amy Lizotte, and James Thomas, our committee clerk, and we're also joined by the deputy clerk, Michael Ball. So thanks to everybody for joining us. So of course today our meeting is live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. To respect physical distancing requirements, our witnesses are attending by video conference. I'd just like to remind all members that our witnesses that all comments, questions, and remarks will need to be directed to myself as chair. Both members and the witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. So now I'd like to introduce and invite Mr. Rubin to proceed with any opening comments he may have, and we do have some questions, of course, that we can use to guide our discussion as well. So Mr. Rubin, thanks very much for joining us. I think you're joining us from home in Tuck. Is that correct?
No, I am joining you from home in Paulatuck, which is about 340 odd miles away from Tuck to the east, so a little direction there.
Okay.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you well. That's great. I'm glad to see you this morning from Paulatuck, and maybe to just get us started, can you tell us a little bit about the Inuvialuit Game Council? I don't know how long you've been involved with them and what kind of work that you folks do in the Inuvialuit settlement region, and maybe that'll just give us a bit of background to start. Thanks.
Okay, so it's just a matter of course. First off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Lawrence Rubin. I've been with the Inuvialuit Game Council for a better part of 14 years, on and off, mostly on, but the Inuvialuit Game Council is a body created under the Inuvialuit Final Agreement to ensure the preservation, conservation of marine and ungulates in the ISR, and also in part to have a decision-making power in regard to the environment through the final agreement. It was signed in 1984, and we haven't even broken the crust yet in regards to understanding our role in management in regards to our species that sustain us, such as caribou, belugas, fishes of all types, muskox, all of those things. So with the territorial government and the federal government, we're still trying to find a way to ensure proper control and proper authority to oversee and manage our species, not only within the ISR, but also within the Northwest Territories. Also, I'd like to say hi to Rocky Simpson Sr., if I'm correct. Am I correct as a senior?
Yeah, you're right.
Hey, Rocky, it's nice to meet you. If you don't remember this, we worked together in Summers Harbor back, and I think it was 1979, at working under Canmore Dome, and I don't forget those days, because you were kind of protective of all the Inuvialuit that worked with Canmore, and we were glad to have you there working with us. So nice to meet you again, Rocky.
Go ahead if you want, Rocky.
Yeah, it's good to hear your voice again, and it was good times back then. It seemed like it was easier times, so it's one of these days, hopefully I get up to Paulituck again. See you, thanks.
Certainly, you got a good welcome. Anyways, unfortunately, I didn't have any presentations in regards to this meeting from the Inuvialuit Game Council. Would have handled it better, but and certainly I would have liked to have met yourselves, not virtually, but in person. But because of COVID and just recent happenings, I think it's better that we all stay where we are, and because of COVID. So. Hopefully the communications will hold for the rest of the day, and we carry on. So that's my introduction of myself and, in short, the Game Council history.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Rubin. Really appreciate it, and I do hope that if we get a chance to visit Paulituck sometime. It's one of the few communities I haven't been to, so. And I know with the nearby National Park, Tuktoyaktuk, you guys have a lot of things going on, so it would be great to get a chance to visit sometime. Maybe we'll just turn to some of the questions here that we sent to everybody to look at and see if we can have a bit of a discussion around some of these areas. One of the first areas that we were interested in kind of looking at in the context of the Wildlife Act and Species at Risk Act was how those apply and work in areas without land rights agreements. I'm not sure how relevant that is, because of course with the Inuvialuit you guys have had your final agreement since 1984, but maybe we could get you to talk a little bit about how you work with other Indigenous governments. Say I know that you've done some work with the SAW2 Renewable Resources Board around Caribou, and can you talk a little bit about the work that you guys have done around Caribou with people in the SAW2? I've been involved with the SAW2 and other groups such as the Gwich'in in the Northwest Territories and other groups in the Yukon. Discussions regarding the porcupine caribou herd, the blue nose east herd, all those herds that reside in the lower portion of the NWT and Nunavut. It's not hard to realize this, but although we're an Indigenous group of peoples, managing a singular species, as we used to say, was easier back then. Now with so many groups to deal with and so many land claims to address in regard to areas where
herds migrate to or calve, decision making has become, really, really strenuous at times, because if we as an Inuvialuit group decide on what to do with migrating caribou or their calving grounds, in other areas it's quite contradictory to our efforts to protect and conserve. In regards to quota systems, management plans for the Blue Nose East and West, in regards to the Cage Show, the Bathurst, Ahayak, Beverly Ahayak herds, those management plans that are in place do have an effect to us in regard to how they come about making their decisions. But working with Indigenous groups within Canada and not so much other groups outside of the Indigenous umbrella, such as non-Indigenous groups from every community, what decisions we make has a larger effect on non-Indigenous groups on how they harvest and hunt in areas with permits and licenses and whatnot. So if you just, look at it and on a piece of paper, it's a jumble of items. But when you break it down to decision-making areas and groups, it's more manageable. But all in all, it's a communication issue. It's a partnership issue with Indigenous groups and non-Indigenous groups that allows us to make proper decisions. So if we make a decision in regard to the ISR on Blue Nose West Caribou, Blue Nose West herd for that matter, it affects the Sawtoo, and it affects the Nunavut area also, in regard to how we make decisions.
No, that's great. Thanks for providing some background on some of the issues you face working with other Indigenous governments. Is there anything in the wildlife legislation or how GNWT does its work that you think could be improved? I guess that's what we're kind of looking at here is things that might be done to help folks like yourselves, the Game Council, do your work better. Is there anything in the wildlife legislation or support from GNWT that could be changed or improved to help you guys do your work? Thanks.
Well, definitely. There are a couple of items. One is under the IFA that states as a group, the Inuvialuit cannot be treated any less different than other claimant groups. So regardless of how you interpret it, the bottom line is that we can't be treated any less different than other claimant groups. It's not black, it's not gray, it's black and white. You either accept it or not. But in saying that, one of the bigger issues that I've had to deal with as an individual and the Inuvialuit Game Council and co-management boards all together is compliance. So when the Environment and Natural Resources Department of GNWT creates a management plan along with or in partnership with other claimant groups or a claimant group, everyone that signs on to those management plans has to be compliant to make those conservation efforts work. And if compliance is not adhered to, then what's the point? There's really no point in signing on to an agreement that one group or one claimant group is not compliant with the management plan. So for us as the Inuvialuit, as a people, it's hard to stomach, because in regard to compliance, the Inuvialuit regional, the Inuvialuit, not the regional corporation, but the Inuvialuit Game Council and all co-management boards are very compliant. We assist ENR. We partner with ENR in research efforts to a point where it's become one of our faults that we're very compliant. But if other groups aren't adhering to compliance in regard to management plans, then we see no point in moving forward, because it breaks everything down.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm looking at my committee members in the room here and on the line. If folks have any questions, feel free to shoot up your hand, and we can work our way through some of these issues. But Ms. Knockleby, you've got a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming today, Mr. Rubin. I love the area that you're from and got a few opportunities to visit there, and hope to get back as well. So if you invite Rocky, I'm coming with him. My question, I guess, is around, I was looking at your website and noticing as well part of your mandate or goal is to preserve the cultural identity, the way of life with subsistence hunting, etc. So I'm just curious if you could speak to us a little bit about what you're doing to engage youth and maybe people that have not necessarily grown up in the Indigenous culture and bringing them back to their culture. Are there programs like that your organization participates in? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Rubin, please go ahead.
Well, that's a question that on many levels. For example, I'm 58 years old this year, or I'll be 59 this year. I grew up in the residential school era. So if you're focusing the question on my generation, then, you know, for us, and Jackie, I think in some part can attest to this, that it's hard for us to navigate, you know, that area where you're asking us, how do we do this, and why do we do this? Certainly we could answer one of the questions for why do we do this in regard to conservation, preservation, our cultural identity, our traditional way of living, to ensure that our future generations can live past this, the residential school era, and go back and look through history where my parents and their parents lived a very simple way of life, being sustained by the creatures of the land and the sea. For myself, though, trying to get back to a traditional and a cultural way of living is something that I individually had to relearn, and it took me quite some time. Being in the school system for a better part of 15 years and finally understanding after getting out of that back in around 2000, where I started realizing that I did have another way of living, which wasn't westernized so much, but getting my language back is one of the main things that I still need to do. But traditional living, cultural way of living, in regard to the youth, we are trying our best, we're doing our best to infuse our youth with knowledge through the school curriculum, on-the-land programs, even ENR taking a part of that in regard to teaching our children our way of living is take a kid harvesting or take a kid trapping. That's a good partnership there, but like I said, that question can be answered on many levels, but ultimately our goal is to protect and conserve, reteach or provide our youth with our knowledge, our traditional knowledge, our cultural knowledge of the way we used to live, and trying to keep it alive.
Thanks, Mr. Rubin. Ms. Knockleby, a follow-up question? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find sometimes, again, too, this technology is hard to have a good conversation, but I completely understand why this needs to be done. I guess my question back then is how can we help you, or the GNWT help you through, like with us pressuring them, to encourage that, or to help you provide some of that supports and help to keep youth. I think that's the biggest point, is if the youth aren't doing it, the elders and people can be doing it as much as they want, and it will never survive. So to me, that's the most important, one of the more important things I see on your page even is that linkage. So how can we support you in doing that? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Knockleby. Go ahead, Mr. Rubin.
Well, the first thing that comes to people's mind is when the governments or the federal or territorial governments ask, how can we help? And funding always comes to mind right away. But when you get past that, there's so many ideas, so many proposals that you can make or create that would allow the partnership of GNWT and the Inuvialuit work together, cohesively. More or less, like I stated earlier, take-a-kid harvesting and take-a-kid trapping has been a success to a certain point. But there are other things that we can do as a claimant group, and you can do as a government, is provide resources, infrastructure, to attain a level of how can I put it? Not education, but to attain a level of understanding and partnership. Because until I haven't seen governments and claimant groups work well for a long time. So there has to be an outlet or a door opening where we can partner without arguing certain points in regard to land management, water, and all of that other stuff that gets in the way, or politics for that matter. There was an attempt a couple of years ago for GNWT and the Inuvialuit, the Gwich'in, to work together, and I think if some of you have recollections of a group of people from GNWT working with the Nahidik, if any of you remember that came up in 2019, I think it was, just prior to, or 2020, just prior to COVID, hitting us like a ton of bricks. I think it was March of 2020 or some date like that. That was an attempt by GNWT to partner with the Inuvialuit and with other groups to bring a bunch of kids out on the Nahidik with an elder to provide cultural teachings. If in the GNWT, in your departments, where you can find a group of people that can attend the Game Council meetings, can attend the IRC board meetings, or co-management boards where, you can get some good ideas to work together, it'll make it so much easier for myself as a director for the Inuvialuit Game Council to work with GNWT and more or less the federal government. But the partnership, the cohesiveness has to be there to pave the road for like a brighter future for both parties, or both governments parties. Sorry.
Oh, thanks very much. No, that's great to get that specific example. I think that's really helpful for us. Sorry, Ms. Knockley, anything further on? No? Okay, you're good on that. Any other questions from committee members? Mr. Bonnetrouge, I see you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Must Mr. Chair, and must Mr. Rubin for appearing before us. It's always a pleasure hearing about what other groups are doing in the Northwest Territories in terms of monitoring their wildlife. I have a question in regards to beluga monitoring. 'Cause you're out in the oceans part there, and I'm kind of wondering how does your council monitor the beluga in your area? If I could ask that, Mussy.
Thanks, Mr. Bonnetrouge. Mr. Rubin, please go ahead.
Well, Mr. Bonnetrouge, thanks for the question. Certainly I could give you a long oral history of beluga monitoring. Well, I'll give you a short version of it. Officially, in politics and other communities in the ISR, we started monitoring belugas back in 1992 as an official start, but prior to that, we've always been observant of what our marine mammals were doing, specifically beluga. But our official monitoring program started back in 1992, where every community was provided through Department of Fisheries and Oceans some sample kits for size, girth, weight, not weight so much, but size, girth, length, stomach content at the initial phase of it. It's grown to the point where our monitors who are out daily annual basis have grown to understand what research does and how it helps, and they've learned step by step how to do it, or communities have learned how to do it without the assistance of DFO. So basically every community that has monitors sample the whales themselves and send the samples out to Winnipeg without the assistance of DFO being present, which they were quite often in the past. So now they sample eyeballs. They know how to extract eyeballs for aging. They extract the jaws, stomach contents, and they understand, in the stomach contents, if there's Arctic cod, or if there's herring, or if there's sand lance, capelin. They understand, if there's those species that the food resources out there are changing, or they're changing their diet. So they put those observations in a template or a paper form and present it to the Game Council and co-management boards as part of their observations and monitoring. So it's grown quite a bit since 92 and earlier, but we're at a point where every community can monitor beluga on an annual basis without question from other groups or without question from DFO in regard to how monitoring carries on in our region.
Thanks very much, Mr. Rubin. Mr. Bonnetrouge, any other questions?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mussy for that, Mr. Rubin. That's very educational. I guess the test kits are similar to what we get down here in the Decho and surrounding areas for moose. There's always been concerns, I guess, when you look at the mining activity in relation to winter roads and any other roads that that possibly affect caribou migration. In relation to the beluga up in the Arctic Ocean, is there any concerns with the shipping routes and the possibility also of opening up your liquid natural gas fields out in the ocean? I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, Masi.
Thanks, Mr. Bonnetrouge. Mr. Rubin, please go ahead.
Okay, I can only, thank you again, Mr. Bonnetrouge. I can only answer in part in regard to the liquid natural gas production site that is proposed to a certain extent. When it was first introduced as a concept, we rolled out, IRC rolled out the proposal to the co-management boards and the Game Council, EISC, the screening committee, the board that takes all that information and screens it to ensure that everything is going to be done as proper and won't affect the surrounding area. But there was a plan, and it was unfortunate how it happened. When the idea came about that it was a goal, GNWT released a paper, and it went on Facebook in regards to shipping of liquid natural gas. That was unfortunate. It was premature, and GNWT was, I don't know, they were reprimanded for it, but it kind of blew up in our faces. So we had to deal with that issue of, with the issue of shipping. There are many things that need to happen prior to shipping taking place within the ISR. There are a lot of rules that are put in place, either mandatorily through EISC for shipping, such as large cruise ships. Mining companies have to inform groups within the ISR if they're passing through. There was a proposed ISOC dock in Nunavut, the ISOC proposal. They had to come to our table and provide us with information in regard to their shipping plans. I'm not sure where that is at this point, but there are many steps that need to take place prior to shipping happening in the ISR. In regard to shipping corridors, we certainly wouldn't mind the help of GNWT to impress upon the federal government that the Beauport Sea, Coronation Gulf, McClure Strait, all those areas need protection. We've tried to impress on the federal government as much as we can in regards to rules and regulations that they provide on the east and west coast in regard to shipping and apply it to the Arctic region. But they're really slow in doing that. So more or less we're dealing with not Mars, notice to mariners. And in regard to shipping, we inform tourism groups back then, I think it was 3 years ago prior to COVID, or 2 years ago, that there are navigation routes for our wildlife species such as dolphin and Union caribou, which migrate from the island to the mainland, like Perry caribou from island to island. Our beluga navigation routes. So we're doing our best, not enforce, but to inform industry, governments about our region. And we're fortunate enough that Canada has signed on apparently to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and how that will affect Canada, the ISR, the Gwich'in, SAW2 for that matter. I mean, if GNWT signs on to implement sections or portions of UNDRIP, then protection will be there to a certain extent where development won't be hindered, but will be, done in a safe manner.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Rubin. Mr. Bonrouge, anything further?
Yes, Mr. Chair, more comment than anything. I guess we can take lessons learned from perhaps the caribou migration studies that possibly have happened already from the mines. Those would be lessons learned there. I just wanted to extend as my colleague, Ms. Knockleby, stated that if there's any concerns or anything else that the GNWT should do to help in your situations up there, to please pass them on to our committee for consideration. Mussy for your presentation, Mr. Rubin. Mussy.
Thanks, Mr. Bonrouge. So yeah, Mr. Rubin, of course, you folks are welcome to contact us at any time. And if you have any other ideas, suggestions about improvements or changes to wildlife management, please let us know. But I'm going to turn to other committee members here as well. Ms. Cleveland, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to Mr. Rubin for joining us here today, all the way from Paulatuck. It's very much appreciated. Recently here in the Yellowknife area, there was discovered to have been about 40 caribou that were hunted illegally. But one of the things that I learned was that there wasn't any wastage involved in the hunt. And so that makes me think of food security. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about kind of the balance between wildlife enforcement and food security when we see things like zero wastage, but still illegal hunt that contributes to the overall sustainability of our wildlife in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. Rubin, please go ahead.
Okay, food security. We've been dealing with this concept or this terminology for, I think, the last 10 years. We signed, or we created a, not a template, but we were a part of the authors for a book created by an Alaskan group of people in regard to food security, and it's helped us to understand the terminology or the concept of food security, so that we could, provide better protection to our species. But any time, such as he stated, that illegal harvest of species, regardless of area, such as Nunavut, Yukon, the lower portions of NWT, even in the ISR, it has an effect on every individual in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, even Nunavut. If something happens in the SAW2 or Wek'èzhìì in regards to illegal harvesting or wastage, then it's impressed upon us that we have to comply. We have to be more strict with our Inuvialuit individuals or groups. So again, in regard to food security, anything in regard to illegal harvesting, food wastage, it affects every community in the Northwest Territories. It affects every community within the ISR, and again, it affects every individual's ability to have food security. Governments have attempted to use this as a tool to say that they're doing good things for the Indigenous people or for the Northwest Territories, such as introducing Nutrition North. It's there. It's still not working to its capacity. But we like that. But country foods, trying to, jump those hurdles where we share with people. And I'll get back to sharing a little later. But country foods, if we go community to community in the ISR, we can trade our foods. We can barter for certain other items other than food. Say for caribou, we get a haunch of caribou to our beneficiaries, and they'll send us some char or they'll send us some muck duck. That's called bartering within the ISR. Getting back to sharing as one of the issues within food security, governments have made it almost impossible for communities to apply sharing as a way of living as we used to do. Sharing now means that if I send something to a non-individual or non-Indigenous person, I would have to comply with the Wildlife Act, where it states that I could give up to 10 kilograms of caribou meat to an individual, a non-beneficiary, but they would have to provide me with a bill of sale or a receipt, just to ensure that things were properly done. But prior to that regulation, sharing food with non-Indigenous groups was, something we saw as a way, not a way, but as a part of our cultural identity, because sharing was always given through our heart and through our feeling, because it was a way that we communicated with other communities in regard to relationships. Sharing was always a big part of our way of living, but it's been removed to a certain extent. Food security, as stated, for caribou, beluga, Arctic char for that matter, even for the smaller things such as ptarmigan. We do our best to protect our resources. Governments such as GNWT and the federal government have to do their part also. In some cases, an understanding in regards to quotas. I'll give you an example. Polituk, if you look on the map, we're a small community. We're about 340-ish people or so. Our community is more or less living or sustaining itself on quotas. We are quoted for the caribou of the Blue-Nosed West Herd. We also get authorization slips from the Blue-Nosed East Herd. I think it's in regard to the Sawtoo area. So we are quoted for caribou. We are quoted to a certain extent for muskox, another part of our food sources. Fortunately, we don't have a quota on moose, but they are very rare in our community or our area. We have a voluntary quota on char, which is our main food source from the marine area. But fortunately, we don't have a quota yet as it goes on beluga. But mainly, we live on a quota system in Polituk, and we try to do our best to comply with the quota systems that either mandatorily or voluntarily. So food security for our small community is very important. But understanding that concept and, how it came about is another thing that we're still trying to do. Basically, we try to explain as a community that, if you say food security, we say a cultural way of living or our traditional way of living. We manage our resources the old way. We encourage our young children to learn conservation or preservation as their new way of living. Growing up, I was told by my father never to get more than you can eat because we never had a freezer, a walk-in freezer, or we never had any real way to preserve our meat, be it fish or caribou. So we were always taught to only get what you need. And that was, in our eyes, a way of protecting and conserving the species. So food security has many different answers, and I hope I've done my best to answer your question to a certain extent.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. Ms. Cleveland, any further questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rubin, for that response. You actually jogged a little bit of childhood nostalgia for me, because one thing that was drilled into our heads all the time growing up in the North is take only what you need, use all that you take, over and over and over again. So no, I appreciate that. But some of the constituents that I serve have reached out in terms of their concern over wildlife conservation, and numerous people have pitched the idea of a requirement to have to participate in a hunt with a respected elder before you can go out and hunt on your own as groups of hunters. And so I'm just kind of wondering if that is something that happens within your community or within the region of the Inuvialuit Game Council, or what your ideas or thoughts are on that one. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. Rubin, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, there are, areas within our co-management boards that try to attain that idea, especially in regards to spring hunts. All and more or less the NWT are going to go out geese hunting. So in Yellowknife, I would expect in Yellowknife that rule applies, where through the land claim groups or even the non-Indigenous groups, that you have to do that. You have to take an elder out with you, or an older person who understands ammunition, weapons, and proper use of those shotguns and rifles and small arms. As a rule, you would probably have to do that in the Yellowknife area, but in the small rural communities, as we're called, it's how we were brought up. It's a natural, it's how we were brought up. That's all I can say. I mean, I was taught by my father, and by my brothers, my older siblings, to understand what you have to do to go out hunting. You have to understand your shotgun, your rifle. You have to learn how to take it apart, to put it back together. And in some cases, you have to, you have to learn how to be inventive in regard to, making new parts and on the spot and fixing it by yourself. They taught us, my father taught me, and my brother taught me how to do that. So as a way of living, as a traditional upbringing, our community does that. All the harvesters, the hunters bring their children out with them, whether they're 7, 8, 9 years old. They start at a young age to understand our traditional way of living. There were many children last spring that took their first geese, and some of them were 8, 9 years old. But they always had an elder or someone who would teach them, like their father, their uncle, or their father's brother, sister, even a woman take part in that. And we take pride in that. We take pride in teaching our children our traditional way of living as a rule, not something that we're told to do. It's just what we do.
Thanks very much for that. That's great to hear. Caitlin, did you, no other questions? Anybody else have any questions? Mr. Simpson, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I've had the luxury of working up north and, and seeing the land and the animals. And I guess that's where I kind of fell in love with polar bears. Working on a ship and looking down and seeing them, on the ice and the seals and that. But, and working there is one thing I've realized is that, this whole issue, it's jurisdictional, and, it's not, maybe at one time we looked at it being localized. However, we know it's not. It's, it involves, communities, involves regions, it involves other territories, it involves other countries as well. And, and I know you talked about co-management and talked about compliance. And I guess my question would be is, looking at co-management, does it go far enough, and how effective is it? Like, we've got the waters, running from, northern Alberta, BC, and, Saskatchewan, running in your direction. And the impacts are there, and as development proceeds, it's going to get, the impacts are probably going to be greater. We have, with the governments now have, we talk about duty to consult, but we don't have that, the all-important consent, of Indigenous peoples, to either, say yes to development or no. So I just kind of wondering, how do you look at the whole issue, I guess, of protection, and does our legislation go far enough? Does this government, do you look at this government as sort of being a cohesive, I guess, unit that makes things, that keeps everybody, working towards co-management, or do you see that as coming from each region? Is it, whose responsibility is it, I guess? So there's probably a lot of questions in there, so you can kind of, I guess it's more about interjurisdictional issues and how that works. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson's well known for jamming as many questions as he possibly can. And so, Mr. Rubin, please go ahead and answer what you're comfortable with, but I'm sure with your experience, we're going to learn a lot, so go ahead.
Well, all I could say about so far as I've heard Mr. Simpson, he's a man after my own character, because I'm known as such. I ask many questions, and sometimes many questions in a question, so I understand where he's coming from, but I'll do my best to answer for a couple of areas of his question in regard to co-management of a species. The polar bear, as you all know, is a global issue. It's not regional, it's not territorial, it's not national, it's international. And the global community has, has their eye on the Canadian region. So co-management has to be seen to be working like a well-oiled machine. So every partnership, be it co-management, every government has to have an understanding of the issue. Polar bears, we've been battling the issue of the polar bear ever since I was input as a director for the Inuvialuit Game Council back in 2009, I think. CITES, as you all understand, is a group of people who create these list of for endangered species or species of special concern, issues within. So in regards to the polar bears, we've been fighting the uplisting, well, ever since I got on, and prior to that. Countries around the world have always attempted to uplist the polar bear to endangered, where there is no going back. There will be no sale nationally, regionally of polar bears, and that is it. They're off to, and nothing can be done about it. So we've been fighting the uplisting for quite some time now, more or less with our co-management groups at hand, such as Wildlife Management Advisory Council, North Slope, and Northwest Territories. The Inuvialuit Game Council has a lot of input in that. We have some individuals who are appointed to groups such as the Polar Bear Commission, the Inupiat Partnership. So we're attempting to have the regional governments, territorial governments, federal governments understand that co-management within the ISR, who more or less oversees a large marine area, is working up here. And the numbers that we provide through the assistance of ENR in regards to polar bear research is it's not contradictory to other governments. It's a number that we estimate that is correct, and not numbers that are provided through outside sources or other governments that they provide to CITES for to the effect of uplisting the species. So currently, in regard to the polar bear issue, we are fighting once again the uplisting of the polar bear as put forward by Norway. Norway has put an attempt in to uplist the polar bears again so that there is no trade allowed globally for the polar bears. Locally, we fight that because locally we have an understanding that there are a lot of polar bears out there. The numbers are sustainable. The quota system works so that we can provide a local economy through the sale of polar bear hide. You know, you guys should know better than I that the situation has taken a downturn in regards to the sales in fur auction areas where Nunavut is sending, or fur auction sites are sending their polar bear hides back to Nunavut, and I guess they will be doing that shortly to the Northwest Territories individuals who harvested polar bears over the last few years, and if they're not sold, they will be given back to those communities and to those individuals who have sold them. So, go figure. Anyways, co-management works up here in regard to the management of polar bears. Globally and nationally, there has to be an understanding that co-management works within the ISR, within the Yukon, and more or less within Nunavut through the quota system. Other issues, or another part of your question, everything has to work together. All governments have to work together, be it indigenous or territorial. We have to work together to move ahead, to get a better understanding of who we are as a territory. You guys take the lead in providing that information to the federal government. They rely on GNWT to give them a better understanding of what's happening within the Northwest Territories. But again, it comes down to a partnership, a working cohesiveness, more or less, between governments to ensure that all wheels are working and oiled well within the Northwest Territories. So I hope that answers some of your questions, Rocky.
Thanks, Mr. Rubin. Well, if it doesn't, we're going to give Rocky another chance. So go ahead, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, there were so many questions in there. I can't remember all of them, but I'm sure it sounded like you hit them all. One issue that comes up, and I know people in my community bring it up, is that, with respect to caribou, we saw the decline in caribou over the years, and now what we're looking at is to basically put a bounty on wolves. And I guess it's hard for me to understand that. I guess somebody's looked at it, but to start start killing other animals that we think that that may impact caribou, and I'm not sure if it's justified or not. But what's your thoughts on that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Rubin?
The caribou issue. I've had the fortune to deal with this issue when Michael Miltenberger was way back when, and it's still the issue. Caribou was ever on the table whenever I went to meetings with governments or indigenous groups, and how to manage them. Back about 10 years ago, when the issue came about, where I think it was more than that, like 2006 or 7, when GNWT proposed that all groups will comply to a management plan in regards to the Blue Nose East, West, Beverly, Ahayek, Bathurst, and all those caribou groups within the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. But it was hard to, impress that upon Nunavut, that there was a problem. But luckily enough, GNWT, took it under their advisement from other groups that there is a problem with caribou, and how to manage them became an issue, because every indigenous group had their own idea on how to manage the caribou within their land rights, within their land claim areas. So we had to deal with it, and we're still dealing with it. We're still trying to understand the complexities of applying one regulation where it may contradict another area. So we're still dealing with that. But in regard to the prey species, the wolf, ever since I can remember, they have always been seen as the major prey species or prey animals on caribou. Back in the 70s, mid-70s, I can remember my father pulling out a whole bunch of wolf heads, telling me that he's going to get $50 per skinned wolf head when he sends them out to, back then it was Arwood or the game warden. Some of you may remember his name just pops out of my head now. But he was always up here in the north, providing help to our harvesters in regard to the wolves. $50 a skinned head was a lot of money back then. But now the bounty has grown to, levels where if you get one wolf, you can provide yourself your family with food for 2 months out of one wolf hide or one sample kit. It's gotten to that point. So whether the issue of money, if the issue of money wasn't there, would there still be the same attempt to call, or the unforgiven word now is bounty. So we can't say bounty anymore for that matter. It's something else that we have to apply to that issue. Anyways, Jim Burke is his name, just popped into my head. You may remember Jim Burke, Ronald, or Jackie. He used to be around the territories, the coastal areas quite a bit. But another issue has popped up just recently, based on information provided by Alberta's resource ministry group of people, where they provide information in regard to their woodland or boreal caribou and the prey species such as the grizzly. But up here now we've seen the grizzly bear as the secondary species that preys on caribou, because there are no other species that they would prey on. Muskox on the offhand, but caribou as a main prey species for the grizzly bear, we see it as a secondary culprit in regard to reducing or depleting our caribou herds. But nothing has been done in regard to grizzly bears. It's a sad, it came upon a sad point where 2 years ago we had to deal with the federal government putting the grizzly bear as special concern, and we were astounded. And we're finding that it was because of Alberta and BC stating that their barren ground grizzly bear, or their types of grizzly bear, were declining. So they said, well, Canada, do something. So it was quite amazing to hear the federal government attempt to do that, while the Northwest Territories, and a lot of you may know that the population growth in regard to grizzly bears by community is, we can't control them anymore. Regardless of our quota system, our management plans, grizzly bears are, a threat to human lives on an annual basis now, because they're always at the dumps, they're in communities multiple times of the year, even in Yellowknife, in Inuvik, Fort McPherson, Aklavik, Paulatuck, even getting to islands. If you don't know this already, Ulahuktok is on Victoria Island. And you must know the hybrid bear that they got there. But now on an annual basis, they're harvesting grizzly bears coming off the mainland. So they're becoming an issue on Victoria Island, and at some point they're going to be inhabiting Banks Island, and they're going to be a problem there for hairy caribou, for polar bears, and stories that ENR has provided us of grizzly bears killing large polar bears out on Ellesmere and other areas. It's expanded that far, so GNWT has to do something with us as a co-management group to address that issue, because if we deny grizzly bears being a prey species on caribou, then the problem will persist. Our caribou will decline further if we don't address the grizzly bear issue in regard to their growth in population. If you want an example, I could give you one that our renewable resource person, one here, or two, I think he is, what he does is report to Norm Snowshoe or Marsha Brannigan or Ernie Francis in Inuvialuit. He reports sightings or observations of grizzly bears on an annual basis from our dump. In Politic, and it's not very big. The most polar bears reported on a single day, not polar bears, but grizzly bears, on a single day in a single sighting was 16 in our small dump. On average, our individual harvesters, even not harvesting grizzly bears, they could see 10 or 12 grizzly bears in a single day in a 150-kilometer trip. So that's one of the issues that we've been dealing with for quite some time, but not getting any foothold in regards to territorial or federal assistance in understanding the grizzly bears and how to deal with them. So we need certainly need some input from GNWT in regards to how to manage the species. We're doing the same thing for caribou in regard to the wolf.
Well, thanks. No, that's really interesting to hear. Much appreciated. I think we're going to try to wrap this up fairly quickly so that we give everybody a break before we hear our next presenter. I've got one more question if I can squeeze it in here. One of the things, of course, we're looking at is how the Species at Risk NWT Act works. And I think you talked a little bit about some of that, with regard to the polar bear and grizzly bear listings. I know a couple of other species in your area have been listed, Peary caribou, and this funny little plant called a hairy brea, which is at Cape Bathurst. But can you talk a little bit about how the species at risk stuff works for you guys, and whether there's any changes or improvements we could make there? Thank you.
Changes and improvements. Certainly we could do with some change, and we could certainly do with some improvements in regards to the issue of species at risk. Now, in the provinces, certainly you can deal with listings of plants, of small herbivores, small omnivorous animals, or let's take for example the bumblebee. So the Inuvialuit Game Council got a listing from the Species at Risk Act, GNWT, to express our concerns in regard to a single type of bumblebee. I forgot which one it was. And we're kind of scratching our heads and wonder, okay, how do we express our concern on a species that terrifies individuals? Even though it's the smallest little thing, people are afraid of it, and all they want to do is get rid of it. So we had to run that through our head a few times to understand, okay, the territorial government wants to do this. How do we help them? Understanding that in every community within the ISR, I can tell you for a fact that there are people afraid of bumblebees, and all they want to do is get rid of them. So how do we apply that to our understanding and assist the governments in protecting or conserving the species? So we had to get an understanding of what they do and what they provide for the environment. Watching documents, reading books, understanding this certain type of species, how it pollinates areas and provides, protection for the environment in regard to future growth. So we have to put that in our heads and say, okay, this is a species we're going to have to, in some way understand and how it affects our region. So there's a question there of, we have to, as an Inuvialuit group of people, understand these little things that Canada put forward to us, because in our region, in our communities, we're sustainable. We live off and we sustain ourselves from the land. We live off caribou. We live off muskox. We live off polar bears, grizzly bears to a certain extent. I remember days where I've had to eat foxes back in the early days, 70s, 80s. Well, not so much recently, but I remember those days. So governments have to have an understanding of the region and what they attempt to protect and conserve, because within the IFA, it doesn't state that we have to protect every plant species, every bumblebee, every mosquito type. It doesn't state that. Not so far as going to say we have to save the environment, but we have to address it. So the government, namely the territorial government, has to have an understanding of the region by consulting, by sitting in meetings, and understanding what our role is within the region. Certainly governments have their role in regard to protection, conservation of the lands, waters, and the environment, and everything within. It's their mandate through their resource departments. But our regional governments have to be understood to a point where, okay, if we're protecting the caribou, then namely that's what we're going to do. We're going to protect the caribou, we're going to protect our lands, our waters, just to ensure that our protected species will survive. But the technicalities of protecting a species is sometimes, we have to dig deeper as a group to understand where governments are coming from. So again, consultation with Indigenous groups has to be first and foremost, to understand our efforts in regard to the Species at Risk Act and how it applies to our governments.
Oh, thanks. No, that's really good to hear. Of course, we can all learn from each other, and I think you've given us a lot to think about today. I think we need to wrap this up pretty quickly. We've got another presenter coming on in a few minutes, but Mr. Rubin, really want to thank you for sharing your years of experience with the Game Council and recognizing that the Inuvialuit were the first to have their land rights agreement settled and have been at this the longest in terms of the co-management process. So again, just want to thank you very much for sharing your experience with us this morning. And if, of course, you have any further thoughts or concerns or issues, you're welcome to contact us at any point in the future. But again, just want to thank you for your time this morning. Folks, we're going to take thanks very much again, Mr. Rubin. We're going to take a short break so that we can just switch out and get on with our next presentation. So again, thanks very much, Mr. Rubin.
So am I done for the day, or am I done for the meeting then?
Yep. Thanks. My name is Kevin O'Reilly, and we're just going to reconvene the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. We're having a public briefing this morning on the, as part of our review of the Wildlife Act and Species at Risk Act, and we had a discussion this morning with Mr. Lawrence Rubin with the Inuvialuit Game Council, and now we're going to hear from Jody Snortland-Pellisy, who's the Executive Director with the Wek'èzhìì Renewable Resources Board. And what we'll do, though, to just get started is just go around the room for a bit of the introductions first, and then we'll turn it over to Ms. Pellisy. So I'm going to start with Mr. Johnson on my left here. Please.
Good morning, Ryland Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Good morning, Caitlin Cleveland, MLA for Cam Lake.
Hi, Jody. Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Rocky Simpson, Hay River, South.
And we're also joined by a couple of MLAs virtually. Mr. Bontrouge, if you'd like to go ahead.
Ron Bontrouge, Techo.
Thanks, Mr. Bontrouge. And I know that Jackie Jacobson, the MLA for Nunakput, is also with us, although he may have just stepped away from his camera for a moment. We also are joined in the room by three of our staff. We've got Amy Lizotte, who's our committee advisor, and James Thomas, who's our committee clerk, and the deputy clerk, Michael Ball, is in the room with us as well. So without any further ado, I want to turn it over to Ms. Jody Pellisy, who's, as I mentioned, the Executive Director for the Wek'èzhìì Renewable Resources Board. And I understand you have a presentation for us, Jody, so why don't you just go right ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Good morning. My name is Jody Pellisy. I'm the Executive Director of the Wek'èezhìì Renewable Resources Board. The WRB would like to thank the Standing Committee for Economic Development and Environment for inviting the board to provide our comments and recommendations today during this review of the Wildlife Act and the Species at Risk Act. The WRB is a renewable resource co-management board established by the Clecho Agreement and legislation in 2005. The board is an institution of public government, which means that the board considers the interests of all renewable resource users and acts in the public interest when making its decision. The WRB has important responsibilities related to the management of wildlife, plants, forests, as well as protected areas in Wek'èzhìì. These responsibilities are found in chapters 12, 13, 14, and 16 of the Clecho Agreement. The WRB's purpose is to work with Clecho citizens, NWT residents, communities, and governments to manage animals, birds, and fish, and their habitats in Wek'èzhìì to benefit people today and future generations. The duties and responsibilities assigned to the board by the Clecho Agreement are an essential part of good renewable resource management in Wek'èzhìì. In accordance with the Clecho Agreement, the WRB adheres to the principles and practices of conservation, including the precautionary principle, in fulfilling its duties. The board considers the relationships between wildlife, the land, and people, and uses the best information available, including Clecho knowledge, scientific knowledge, and expert opinion to inform its decision-making. The board is then able to make balanced decisions supporting the Clecho philosophy of strong like two people. Today, I will focus on three main topics identified by the committee in its review of the NWT Wildlife Act and the NWT Species at Risk Act. First, co-management of wildlife with Indigenous governments from unsettled areas. Second, community-based wildlife management. And third, Indigenous guardian programs. But before I do, the WRB would like to identify the The excellent and far-reaching work done by GNWT's Department of Environment and Natural Resources during the development of the NWT Wildlife Act and the NWT Species at Risk Act, particularly in addressing co-management matters. This ready-made framework is recommended for use by the GNWT in the development of future legislation. The WRB notes that implementation of the Species at Risk Act is well established and satisfactory. While implementation is underway for the Wildlife Act, it is too early to evaluate its effectiveness, as many parts of the Act have only just gotten regulations, and there are still many more regulations to develop. The GNWT must ensure continued involvement of renewable resource boards in the development of policy and regulations after an act is enacted. This collaboration is necessary to fully reflect the NWT's modern framework for cooperative and coordinated management over wildlife, forests and plants, and protected areas. Next slide, please. The committee has requested input about co-management of wildlife with Indigenous governments from areas with ongoing negotiations of lands, resources, or self-government agreements. With respect to the WRB process, the board has considered evidence provided by IGOs during its wildlife management proceedings, including its most recent review of the joint wolf management proposal submitted by the Clecho government and the GNWT. During government processes, such as the Conference of Management Authorities, Species at Risk Committee, and the Section 15 Wildlife Act meetings, the WRB notes that involvement by IGO representatives as participating observers has been beneficial to ensuring all information and perspectives are included in decision-making. However, the WRB reminds the committee that during drafting of the NWT Wildlife Act, there was opposition to unsettled areas having specific decision-making authorities. While these IGOs should be treated fairly and equitably, the GNWT must be careful not to grant legal authority where it does not exist, and that will have no adverse effect on settled area institutions and rights. Next slide, please. In all 4 land claim areas of the NWT, the groups chose to include wildlife co-management by independent, objective boards alongside strong, rights-bearing organizations. Community-level wildlife management is where science and traditional knowledge come together to generate good, objective wildlife and wildlife habitat-related decisions. As political institutions, Indigenous wildlife rights protection and enhancement is the IGO's responsibility. By taking the best of both management visions, this melds the government and community strengths through wildlife co-management while ensuring co-managers are objective and accountable. This is another example of the Clecho philosophy of strong like two people. Next slide, please. Community-based wildlife management is essential to appropriate and effective wildlife management decision-making. It is not an alternative to the GNWT's role in wildlife science. Rather, it is an opportunity to enhance and expand our knowledge while getting a more fulsome understanding of problems and potential solutions. A great example of a community-based wildlife management program is the Clecho government's Ekwo Nahodeke program, or Boots on the Ground. The Ekwo Nahodeke program is a Kokoti Ekwo, or Bathurst Caribou, monitoring program based upon the traditional knowledge of Clecho and Inuit Indigenous elders and harvesters. The objectives are to monitor the conditions of the Kokoti Ekwo herd on their summer range. This program has recently expanded to include monitoring of the Sati Ekwo, or blue-nosed caribou. The GNWT should support, collaborate, and fund community-based monitoring programs to support the collection of both knowledges. Next slide, please. Additionally, GNWT should assist with the establishment and funding of Indigenous Guardian programs. Formalizing these programs at the community level will ensure that the benefits to be derived are in relation to wildlife and wildlife habitat management. However, the formal role of guardians should be carefully thought through to ensure that management and conservation roles that are already allocated to either renewable resource boards or community-based organizations such as hunters and trappers committees are not impacted. Next slide, please. The WRRB believes that the focus of Guardian programs should be monitoring the land and all of its parts based on the knowledge of the elders and harvesters. This includes species at risk. It should be noted that most species at risk are not game animals, but instead are birds, plants, and insects. While Guardians can assist with monitoring these species at risk, programs that focus on facilitating the protection of habitats to improve species at risk outcomes should be considered. While the WRB feels that Guardians should work closely together with renewable resource officers to make certain that wildlife and wildlife habitat are properly protected, the board feels that Guardian programs should not be involved with enforcement. Enforcement actions take place in a highly legal context, which require significant training and management to protect the public interest. Community-based organizations, such as hunters and trappers committees in the settled areas, already have a role in enforcement. The board sees each role, guardians, renewable resource officers, hunters and trappers committees, undertaking specific functions. By focusing each group on specific functions and working together, this can ensure that appropriate and effective wildlife management happens. Next slide, please. Wildlife and wildlife management are culturally, economically, and spiritually important to all Northerners. The WRB recommends that the GNWT continue to build relationships with renewable resources co-management boards and ensure balanced decision-making by using both traditional knowledge and science. The board urges the GNWT to consider forward-looking wildlife management to face serious challenges such as climate change and the biodiversity crisis. Wildlife laws should reflect the importance of wildlife and wildlife habitat and be robust enough to face future challenges. By facing challenges collaboratively within and across jurisdictional boundaries, wildlife and wildlife habitat can be effectively conserved and managed for future generations. Next slide, please. That's it. Thanks for listening and considering the board's comments today. If there's any questions, I can do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Pelosi. Really appreciate your presentation and your time today. So I'm going to turn it over to my committee members here for questions. And I'm waiting for, Ms. Knockleby, go ahead.
Thank you. I was just saying I didn't need to actually go first again, but I will. I thank you so much for coming and presenting with us, and bet you're glad to not have all the Girl Guide cookies in your house this year, Jody. So my question is around, as a former consultant, we often had community engagement and training programs built into our RFPs where we were supposed to come in and train community members on things like water and soil sampling, etc. So that sort of falls in line with what I sort of see the Guardian programs being eventually, is taking on a lot of that component. I guess my question for you is, how effective does the board find that type of sort of on-the-side training tacked onto RFPs? Is that really effective use of GNWT money, or should we be looking to take those pieces off those RFPs and creating a more fulsome program? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Knockleby. Ms. Palsy, go ahead.
Thank you, Katrina. Yes, I'm very happy I don't have 400 cases of Girl Guide cookies in my house. With respect to your question, so the WRB is not a part of those RFPs that get sent out for consultants to include training and engagement as a part of their programs. We do feel that Guardian programs are a way to have better community involvement in sampling and monitoring, and it can include these scientific processes. So they do need to have the training. And so this, I would say through RFPs, it is a way to get that training completed. But we also have to remember that Guardian programs are also meant to be run in a traditional manner of being out on the land, monitoring, watching, seeing what they see, and coming back and reporting on that. That's specifically what the Eco Nahadike program does, is they're out on the land and they're just watching what's going on. They're recording every day. There is some scientific work being done at the same time, but primarily it's watching the land from a more traditional perspective. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks for that. I'll go back to Ms. Knockleby for follow-up question, please.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's clearly an important distinction that I probably wasn't really aware of. So I appreciate knowing that yeah, it's more from a holistic maybe standpoint than versus grabbing all the actual data and numbers type program. But I guess for me then that leads me to think that these could be they don't need to be sort of exclusive of each other. They could be very collaborative in the sense of you have your on the land Guardian program, but then they spend time with those consultants or people when they are out doing their work so that they can inform them. I did find that my work was better informed whenever I went into camp. I usually ended up talking to the local workers versus always the group in the environmental department. I would talk with people, laborers, etc., and it always gave me a lot more of a fulsome picture of what was going on. So I do agree that this is a really strong component or key that's needed. I guess then my question would be, and I know this is not really around the Species at Risk Act, but I've got you here, is how we could then maybe improve that type of collaboration where perhaps the water boards could have more input back, or is there maybe that's a better question, is there already sort of that mechanism between the ENR contaminated sites group getting the work done and the water boards so that they could help have a bit more of a holistic discussion? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Knockleby. I'll go to Ms. Palsy. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. To be clear, I'm speaking on behalf of renewable resources boards, not land and water boards, but I can speak to my knowledge that land and water boards do undertake surveillance network programming, and there are community leadership or folks in the community who lead those programming along with the land and water boards for collecting of water samples or whatever specific requirements are needed to be collected. Yes, I do think that these programs can be collaborative, and Guardians can certainly also do collection of scientific information once they've been trained. And I think that sort of lends itself to what I said earlier about enforcement. Everybody has their role. Everybody should really focus on those sorts of things, but it all is collaborative at the same time. So thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Palsy. Anything further? Go ahead, Ms. Knockleby.
Sorry, yes, and I did misspeak. I should have said the resource board, not the water board, and it goes to show we got a lot going on in our heads here as a committee, so thank you for that.
Thanks. Any other questions from committee members? Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Ms. Pelosi, for presenting today. Yeah, I think committee has focused on the guardian issue as this is an area we'd like to be expanded. I think we would like to see the GNWT fund some more things in this area, but I think there's a big debate about, you know, what exactly that a guardian is. And I'm curious, you stated that you don't think guardians should take on enforcement. And I guess I think the debate there is perhaps there is a path forward for community-led enforcement to get more buy-in from communities. But I fully understand the complexities of, you know, being an officer and going through the entire prosecutorial system. That is very complex. But so I guess if we're not going to devolve more enforcement powers to guardians or to indigenous governments or to some sort of, you know, model outside of public government, perhaps you could just speak to how what you think GNWT should be prioritizing right now to get more enforcement. I just don't see us going through the next few years without every single year having one of these stories of, you know, the Bathurst caribou being just egregiously, you know, harvested beyond the quotas that the WRB works so hard to, you know, negotiate and go through all of this work. It just undermines the process. So I guess if you could speak a bit to how you think the GNWT can get better enforcement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Pelsi, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for the question. The WRB works very closely with the GNWT, Department of Environment and Natural Resources, as well as the Clecho government with respect to monitoring what is happening, particularly out along the winter road north to Contuedo. During the winter months, we have a special working group, the Barren Ground Caribou Technical Working Group, that meets monthly, and as we're in the middle of the harvesting season, we actually meet bi-weekly or weekly. So we are always trying to better improve monitoring and identifying what is being harvested, as well as assisting with any enforcement out there. This year, along with the renewable resource officers, there were community monitors from the Clecho, from the Yellowknives, and from the NSMA groups. And they all were monitoring harvest along the road. I think this was the first year that had been fully implemented. So I think that is a place where prioritization can be put, is ensuring that those community monitors work, that there's some kind of training along with the renewables officers so they can better understand each other's roles, be better there to support one another in instances of, as you say, the poaching or whatever you want to call it, the over harvesting for sure. It may be that during that crazy time that the winter road is open, that the GNWT may need to consider bringing in enforcement officers from other regions, just like you do during fire season, where you send firefighters to other regions when they need it, or when officers are sent up to mile 222 on the Camel Trail to provide better enforcement there. I think having more officers available along with those community harvesters would serve to help with enforcement. And then also, if you can get those pesky critters to not all stand within the mobile zone and some of them stand outside so they can be harvested, then that will help too.
Yeah, thanks. If you figure out how to talk to caribou, let us know. But yeah, I'm going to go back to Mr. Johnson. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the other thing committee is struggling with is that we're required to review the Wildlife Act, which was, decades of work and no easy feat to get passed in the first place. And And ENR is just heading into phase 3 of regulations. We still haven't fully even implemented the act. It's been about a 20-year process. So it becomes, as a legislature, it becomes difficult to say, okay, let's start changing things in the act right now when we know there's just this giant framework of work that's been done and still to be done. So with all that being said, I guess as you have been going through each of the phases of regulations and working with ENR, have you flagged any changes to the Wildlife Act that the board would prioritize? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Johnson. Over to you, Ms. Pelosi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for the question. Really, no, at this time, as I had said during the presentation, it really is quite early in the implementation of the Act, and being that there are still quite a number of regulations that need to be implemented. We do have phase 2 regulations now implemented, but just implemented. So really, has there been a chance to see that they're implemented well? We're still working on that, I would say. And now we'll be going into the phase 3 regulations. At this time, I think the board is happy with what is in the Wildlife Act at this time, and are not seeking any specific changes. We just feel like it's too early in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Pelosi. That's fair enough. Mr. Johnson, anything further? Okay. I've got a couple of questions, if I can. I don't see anybody else ready to go ahead. So I know you wear another hat. This may not be a fair set of questions for you, but I know that you chair the Conference of Management Authorities, and I just wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that work. It does focus on species at risk and how it works with the federal system, and whether there's room for any changes or improvements in how we manage species at risk. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. O'Reilly.
Sorry, what I might say too is,
okay.
I know you're wearing your WRRB hat here today, and maybe we might think about having you come back wearing a different hat at some point, but because I know that's a different system and so on, but I just thought, while we've got you here, we'll at least crack this egg and see how far we can go. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. O'Reilly. Sure, no problem. I can switch hats. I have found the longer I'm here in the north, I have found more hats to wear, the CMA chair being one. So CMA, Conference of Management Authorities. This is the conference that's made up of wildlife management authorities that are here in the NWT. So organizations that have wildlife management authority, renewable resource boards from settled land claim areas, the Clecho government, and the GNWT. When I spoke earlier today about Indigenous organizations from unsettled areas, they also participate at the Conference of Management Authorities table. We have called them participating observers, meaning that they sit at the table, they participate in discussions right up until voting time, and then as they do not have specific legislated management authority, they get their information is used by the GNWT for their when they make their votes. The conference, we take over once the Species at Risk Committee has finished their work. The Species at Risk Committee are the ones who assess species to determine how well they are doing here, specifically in the NWT. That should not be confused with the federal system of COSEWIC. COSEWIC is a national body that does assessment of species across Canada. So once a species is assessed by the Species at Risk Committee, it comes to the Conference of Management Authorities, And there are requirements for first listing. If a species is listed, depending on how they are listed, what category they're placed in, will determine what sort of recovery document is required to be produced. So the conference is then responsible for producing those recovery documents, and then following the development of those recovery documents is implementation of the documents and the implementation of the actions that are found within. All three of those specific items require consensus agreements by the affected areas. So for instance, if we're dealing with barren ground caribou, which were listed as threatened, all of the management authorities in the NWT were a part of those consensus agreements. They were required to develop a recovery strategy and have a consensus agreement for that. And we've just recently signed off on the implementation actions for those recovery, for the recovery strategy, and those should be in place by July of this year. Now, if it's a species that is found only in one region, like the hairy bria is only found in the Inuvialuit settlement region, then that consensus agreement is made up of only the Wildlife Management Advisory Committee as the Inuvialuit Board and the GNWT. So there can be a number of organizations, management authorities that participate on any one particular file related to species at risk. And now I think I've overtalked, and so maybe I'll ask if I'm answering what you wanted to hear, and if you have any more questions, because I can talk about this all day, and I don't think you want to have me all day. So.
Thanks. Well, I don't mind chatting with you all day, but I think my colleagues would get a bit tired. But yeah, no, I think you helped to explain how the species at risk function sort of works in the NWT. And I know it's relatively new, but are there any things that we could do to change in terms of changes to the legislation, the way it works, to improve management of species at risk? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. I would say that the legislation is flexible enough that it has allowed both the Species at Risk Committee and the Conference of Management Authorities to develop their processes and internal workings so that we can improve as we have conducted assessments since this legislation has come into place. We're actually now at the 10-year mark for several of our species. So we're actually now at a reassessment phase for some of our species. So over the last 10 years, things have been refined. Most recently with the Species at Risk Committee, there's been the development of traditional knowledge biological criteria in addition to the scientific biological criteria. That has just been used in the most recent Species at Risk Committee meeting just a few weeks ago, where they reassessed polar bears. So we're better including traditional knowledge and that information in coming to decisions about assessments for species, and then that leads into the Conference of Management Authorities processes. And we've improved that process over time by ensuring that we have the appropriate people at the table, like those participating observers that we spoke about, and working our way through development of recovery strategies or management plans for these species. So I think I would say at this time, the Species at Risk Act is working well. The biggest piece, of course, always is implementation of those recovery strategies. And so that is where the CMA has now changed its focus from listing and getting those documents in place to actually implementing those documents. And so that's where I would say we're still in a little bit in the infant stages, and we're working out the kinks as we go. But legislation-wise, I don't think there are any required changes at this time. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, and that's really helpful, because I think you're probably the best person to be asking these questions. But of course, we're going to try to chat with as many of the management boards as we can during our review here. But thanks. I'm looking at our committee members to see if anyone else has any questions for Ms. Pelosi. Mr. Bonnet Rouge, please go ahead.
Merci, Mr. Chair, and merci to Ms. Pelosi for her presentation. We don't have the speaking notes that you're speaking from in relation to your slides. I'm just wondering if you would be able to share that with us, because I did note that you're speaking from wearing two hats, like two people probably. But because you're a chair of a larger organization, but in your speech too, I don't know if it's has anything to do with the northern component regarding the Wek'èzhìì board. But what struck me is that we got non-claimant groups. I kind of represent the Decho community of Fort Providence and Wek'èezhìì, but I don't represent them at the Decho First Nations table. They're unsettled groups. And the other one, I guess you would know, is Akecho. But regarding species at risk, I never thought there would have been any political lines drawn to say that non-claimant groups shouldn't have any part in decisions. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate more on your statements. I could be wrong on a lot of fronts, but I apologize if I am, but I just thought I'd start with that. Merci.
Thanks, Mr. Bonnet Rouge. Ms. Pelosi, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bonnet Rouge. Yes, I can share my speaking notes. I was frantically finishing them this morning, and that's why they hadn't been shared yet. The speaking notes are speaking directly from the WRB and not as my role as Conference and Management Authority's chair with the questions that I just addressed for Mr. O'Reilly, to be clear. So these speaking notes are specifically for the Wek'èezhìì Renewable Resources Board. With respect to species at risk and Indigenous governments that are coming from unsettled areas, these groups are involved at the table. As I said, we have made it so that organizations without management authority, because they do not have settled land claims, that has made them so that they have a renewable resources board or some other organization that would manage wildlife on their behalf. So we have Indigenous governments at the table, and they are considered participating observers. Yes, there should be no politics involved with species at risk, and with the people that have been at our table have been very good at doing their best to keep politics off the table. But I'm sure, as you're well aware, when you don't have a specific group that's only there just to deal with wildlife management, politics has a way of creeping into the equation. So that is what I was referring to, is we just want to make sure that groups, once they're settled and have their management authority, they would be included in the legislation similar to the other renewable resources boards. For now, they're treated equally and fairly at the table. Their information and perspectives are included in all of our decision makings. But at this time, they don't have legal wildlife management authority, and we want to be sure that authority isn't given before it is required. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ms. Palsy. Mr. Bonnet-Rouge, any further questions?
Mussy, Mr. Chair, and Mussy for that, Ms. Palsy. I know everything can get political here when you're talking about claimant groups, non-claimant groups, as the GNWT preaches. But I'm just going to end on that note. I don't want to go any further on that one. Mussy.
Thanks, Mr. Bonnet-Rouge. Any other questions from committee members? Well, okay, maybe I'll just ask, I'm going to maybe follow up on Mr. Bonnet-Rouge's question, but I'll ask you with your Wek'èzhìì Renewable Resources hat. And I think you started off with your with some general comments about the fact that the Wek'èzhìì Renewable Resources Board is it's not government, it's an independent board. The members are half appointed, as I understand it, by federal GNWT representatives, and the other half are from the Clecho government. But it is independent, and anybody can participate in the board proceedings as I get it, and those rules and so on are laid out pretty clearly. And at the end of the day, the board does make its own decisions on quotas and makes its own recommendations on other matters, and then those go to GNWT and the Clecho government for final sign-off. So even if an Indigenous government does not have a settled agreement, they're still free to participate in your process. Am I getting this right? Is there anything you'd like to change or correct in what I said? Thanks, Ms. Palsy, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. You are correct. The WRB is an institution of public government, so we operate within the public interest. Our board is made up of half Clecho government appointees and half government appointees, some from the GNWT and some from the federal government organizations. When the board is undertaking a proceeding, they are public. We have a public registry, and we are open to having settled or unsettled claimants in Indigenous organizations. I know some people don't like the settled, unsettled, claimant, non-claimant, whatever you want to call yourselves, the Indigenous organizations without a land claim. Without specific boards. They are still invited to participate, and most often are the ones who make themselves interveners or participants in our proceedings, and have provided very good evidence that the board has considered. You only have to just look at the board's recent reasons for decision with respect to wolf management to see how much they relied on organizations outside of government for providing information. I think that I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, thanks. No, that's helpful to understand how the Wek'èzhìì Renewable Resources Board works as a co-management authority. I'm looking to my committee colleagues here. Any further questions for Ms. Palsy? Okay, I don't see anything further, so I'd like to thank you very much for your time today and allowing us to sneak in some questions with your other hat as the chair of the CMA, so Conference of Management Authorities. So very much appreciate the chance to chat with you about some of what it does as well. So of course, if you have any further thoughts or concerns, issues around wildlife management and how the Wildlife Act or the Species at Risk NWT Act work, you're welcome to contact us. And we may see fit to contact you at some point in the future during the course of our review to get any some further questions or clarification. But once again, Masi Cho for spending some time here with us this morning and sharing your experience. If you have any closing comments, please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate on behalf of the WRB the opportunity to come in and speak with you today. And I will provide my speaking notes to James so that he can share them with you. As a reminder, they're WRB speaking notes, not CMA speaking notes. All of that was off the top of my head, so I don't have anything written. And yeah, thank you. We really do appreciate the opportunity to come before you and give us our perspective. So thank you. You have a great day.
Okay, thanks again very much. So to get a motion for committee to go in camera. Ms. Knockleby, I don't see objections, so committee is going to go in camera. And but thanks to the public for watching our proceeding this morning, and we'll take a short break while we get ourselves organized. Thank you.